The world doesn't clap for comebacks it didn't predict. There's a strange moment that happens after something dreadful breaks you. Not during the chaos, not while you're scrambling to survive, but much later, when things are finally working again and you're standing on solid ground. You notice it in rooms where conversations pause for half a second too long, in the way certain people suddenly listen more carefully, in how praise becomes awkward, delayed, or oddly formal. That's not coincidence. That's recognition struggling to find the right tone. Here's a fact most people never hear. Studies on post-adversity performance show that only a small fraction of people who experience major setbacks ever return to their previous level of functioning, let alone exceed it. The majority plateau, some regress, and many quietly rewrite their expectations downward. So when someone doesn't just recover, but comes back sharper, calmer, and structurally stronger, it triggers attention at higher levels. Not emotional attention, strategic attention. The kind that evaluates, not celebrates. What makes this even more uncomfortable is that your success doesn't look dramatic. There was no viral breakdown to breakthrough arc, no loud redemption tour. You didn't come back waving scars like credentials. You came back efficient, organized, slightly harder to read. That's the part people don't know how to react to. Suffering is familiar. Competence after suffering feels unfair. And yes, there's a small, almost humorous irony here. The same people who once offered advice now clear their throats before speaking. The ones who expected you to need them now check your tone for cues. It's not envy exactly, it's recalibration. You survived something that was supposed to reduce you, and instead it edited you. Less noise, better judgment, fewer emotional expenses. This isn't a story about being admired in public. It's about being quietly assessed by people who understand stakes, hierarchy, and outcomes. A very important group has noticed, not because you announced your growth, but because growth of this kind leaves evidence. And once that evidence exists, it can't be unseen. Number one, you didn't just survive the damage, you metabolized it. Most people treat damage like something to escape from. They distract themselves, deny it, romanticize it, or drag it around as proof of how hard life has been. You did something far less common. You used it. Not in a dramatic, motivational way, but in a quiet, almost practical way. You let it change how you think, how you decide, and how you move. What broke you didn't make you louder. It made you more precise. You learned where energy leaks, where trust is misplaced, where effort is wasted. Pain became data. Loss became information. Failure became feedback. That's what people miss when they look at your success and assume luck or timing. They don't see the internal processing that happened while you were rebuilding. Metabolizing damage means it stops being emotional and starts becoming functional. You stopped reacting from wounds and started operating from understanding. You no longer confuse urgency with importance. You no longer chase validation because you've seen how quickly it disappears under pressure. That kind of clarity doesn't come from books or advice. It comes from having things stripped away and still choosing to think clearly. Important people recognize this instantly. They've seen talent collapse under stress. They've seen confident people crumble the moment things go wrong. So when they notice someone who went through something dreadful and came back calmer, sharper, and more deliberate, it registers as a different category of person. Not inspirational, reliable. You don't panic the way you used to. You don't overcommit. You don't explain yourself unnecessarily. That's not emotional numbness. That's digestion. The damage passed through you and left behind structure instead of chaos. What impresses them most isn't that you survived. Survival is common. What's rare is turning hardship into judgment, restraint, and depth. You didn't let pain harden you into bitterness or soften you into excuses. You refined yourself, That's why your presence feels heavier now, even when you say less. You carry experience that has been processed, not paraded, and people who understand power, responsibility, and long-term outcomes know exactly what that means. Number 2, you returned without bitterness, which frightened them more than anger ever could. After something dreadful, bitterness is the expected outcome. People brace for it. They prepare to forgive it, manage it, or quietly avoid it. Anger is understandable. Resentment is familiar. It gives everyone a script to follow. You didn't give them that comfort. You came back without poison in your voice, without that sharp edge that says, "Look at what they did to me." And that absence unsettled people more than open rage ever would. Anger can be debated, softened, or dismissed as emotional. Bitterness can be labeled as weakness. But calm, clean return offers no easy explanation. What confused them was not your success, but your tone. You didn't weaponize your past. You didn't keep score out loud. You didn't demand emotional compensation for what you endured. That signaled something dangerous in the best sense. You had processed what happened instead of letting it rot inside you. People expect wounds to leak. When yours didn't, they had to reconsider you. Because someone who isn't bitter can't be manipulated through guilt, flattery, or pity. They don't react the way others do. They don't bite when provoked. They don't need closure from the people who hurt them. Your lack of bitterness didn't mean you forgot. It meant you extracted the lesson and left the rest behind. That takes discipline most people don't develop in a lifetime. It shows emotional sovereignty. You decide what gets access to you now. Important people understand this instinctively. They know that resentment drains focus and clouds judgment. They've seen how bitterness destroys promising minds. So when they observe someone who went through something dreadful and still shows up measured, fair, and self-directed, it commands respect. Quiet respect, but real. There's also an unspoken fear there. If you had come back angry, they could predict you. But you returned clear. That means you're not driven by old pain. You're driven by intention. And intention is far harder to control than emotion. So they watch you differently now. Not to see if you'll explode, but to see how far you'll go without carrying the weight they expected to slow you down. Number 3, you rebuilt in silence, not because you were humble, but because you were calculating. Most people think rebuilding quietly is humility. They think it's a virtue to keep progress private, as if silence itself proves character. You didn't rebuild in silence for virtue. You did it because you understood something few ever do. Noise signals weakness before it signals strength. You weren't hiding. You were strategizing. Every move you made, every decision you refined was measured, deliberate, and intentional. While others were busy explaining themselves or proving they were recovering, you were quietly reshaping everything. You didn't announce victories because announcing them too early invites interference. You didn't broadcast recovery because public attention can create pressure that collapses momentum. Every success, every lesson learned, every habit rebuilt was internalized first, tested, and reinforced before it even touched the surface. That's a level of discipline that few can recognize, but very important people notice immediately. The silence created mystery, and mystery breeds respect. They couldn't predict your next move. They couldn't measure you against their expectations because there were no signs to follow. You became a presence that couldn't be preempted, controlled, or dismissed. That's not subtlety. That's mastery. Silence also meant freedom. You weren't beholden to opinions, praise, or criticism. You answered only to outcomes. You built frameworks for yourself that operated independently of recognition. That independence is magnetic to people who understand influence and power. It tells them you're not reacting to the world, you're moving it. What makes this so impressive is that it requires patience most people don't possess. You resisted the urge to broadcast every small victory, to justify your choices, to seek reassurance. Instead, you let the work speak for itself. By the time anyone realized how much ground you had gained, it was undeniable. You weren't just back, you had advanced, often past those who assumed they had the advantage. They see it, even if they don't say it aloud. The quiet rebuilding shows them intelligence, restraint, and long-term vision. That kind of calculated growth leaves no emotional breadcrumbs, only results. And results are impossible to ignore. Number 4, you stopped asking for permission without announcing rebellion. After something dreadful, most people either collapse under the weight of others' expectations or lash out to prove they still matter. You did neither. You didn't beg for approval, and you didn't stage dramatic defiance. You simply moved forward. That's the part that commands attention. It's not flashy, it's not loud, but it's far more unsettling than shouting because it signals one thing very clearly. You operate on your own terms now. By stopping the habit of asking for permission, you rewrote your relationship with authority, influence, and opportunity. You no longer rely on validation to justify your steps. You stopped negotiating your worth through the lens of others. Important people notice this instantly because it's rare. Most people still frame their actions around who is watching. You don't. You assess what's necessary, execute it, and let the results speak. That independence isn't reckless. It's calculated power. And because you didn't announce rebellion, you avoided the traps most would fall into. There's no headline, no drama, no symbolic gestures meant to intimidate. Those who once expected to control or manipulate you suddenly realize there's nothing to control. Your silence in action is louder than any protest. It's the kind of presence that forces people to recalibrate their assumptions about influence, authority, and hierarchy. This shift also demonstrates emotional intelligence. You're not reactive. You're not performing defiance for effect. You're simply unwilling to grant others leverage over your life. That sends a subtle but undeniable message. You understand leverage better than most. And when very important people recognize that someone is self-directed and strategically autonomous, it triggers deep respect. They see it in how you move, in how you decide, in how your outcomes no longer require justification. You've taken the space you need without asking anyone's permission and without turning it into a spectacle. That's a kind of control most people spend their lives chasing, unaware that it begins with a single internal decision: to stop seeking approval. And once they notice it, it leaves a lasting impression that can't be unmade. Number 5, you outgrew the story that once made you relatable. There's a moment after surviving something dreadful when the version of yourself people once understood no longer exists. The story that made you relatable, the one that invited sympathy, casual advice, or emotional bonding, no longer fits. You didn't outgrow it by accident. You outgrew it because the experience changed your priorities, your thinking, and the very way you perceive the world. That shift is jarring to anyone who was used to placing you in a familiar narrative. People are comfortable relating to struggle because it creates connection. It makes you predictable. It gives them a way to measure themselves against you. But when someone outgrows that narrative, suddenly the familiar touch points vanish. They can't predict your reactions, your decisions, or your limits. That unpredictability commands attention without a single word. It creates a subtle tension. They are watching someone who has evolved beyond their emotional grasp. Outgrowing your relatable story doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. It means you've shifted the foundation of your existence. You think differently. You operate differently. Your motivations are no longer explained by hardship or emotional need. They're explained by intention and strategy. That makes you harder to categorize, and categorization is the lens people use to measure power and influence. Without it, you become unknowable in the best sense. This change is magnetic to very important people because they instinctively recognize growth that isn't performative. They've seen people use suffering as an identity, as a platform, or as a crutch. You didn't. You allowed the experience to refine your abilities, sharpen your judgment, and elevate your presence. The story that once elicited empathy now only underscores your autonomy and capability. The truth is, this evolution makes people uneasy and impressed at the same time. They see someone who has survived, adapted, and advanced without seeking their validation. The relatability that once made you familiar is gone, and in its place stands someone undeniable, someone whose trajectory they can respect but cannot easily influence. That is rare. That is remarkable. And that is exactly why they take notice. Number 6, you became harder to read, not colder. After surviving something dreadful, most people assume strength looks like toughness or emotional distance. They think being hard to approach is the same as being cold. You took a completely different path. You became harder to read, not because you shut people out, but because you mastered control over your inner world. Every reaction, every expression, every decision now carries weight, not noise. People notice it immediately, even if they can't put it into words. Being harder to read isn't about hiding feelings. It's about choosing when and how to reveal them. You've learned that transparency can be exploited and emotion can be manipulated. So you present only what is necessary, never excess. Your calm, measured responses create an aura of unpredictability. Others can't anticipate your next move, and that ambiguity is quietly intimidating. It's not fear they feel, it's respect, edged with caution. Important people recognize this instinctively. They've seen those who react impulsively or reveal too much crumble under pressure. They've seen vulnerability weaponized. When they encounter someone who has been through the worst and still maintains composure without becoming unreadable in a detached way, it signals intelligence and discipline. They understand that this is someone who isn't governed by impulse or emotion. They understand that this is someone who operates on clarity, strategy, and intention. There's also a subtle power in restraint. You don't over-explain yourself. You don't overreact. You let others fill in the blanks, and in doing so, they create their own narratives about your strength. That's influence without effort. You don't need to assert it. They recognize it. Becoming harder to read also gives you freedom. You can act, adapt, and navigate without interference because people can't predict or manipulate your responses. That's the difference between fear and respect, chaos and control. You didn't become cold, distant, or untouchable. You became deliberate, discerning, and inevitably influential. And that shift, subtle as it may be, leaves a lasting impression on everyone who notices it. Number 7, you no longer explain your decisions, only your outcomes. There's a subtle shift that happens after someone has faced something truly dreadful and survived it. They stop justifying themselves. Most people feel the need to explain, to rationalize, to convince others that their choices make sense. You didn't do that. You stopped explaining your decisions and started letting your outcomes speak for themselves. That's a seismic difference, and people notice it immediately. When you explain every move, you're essentially giving others a script for influence. You open doors to doubt, negotiation, and control. By stepping away from explanation, you close those doors. You no longer rely on others to validate your thinking. You make choices, you act, and the results become the only conversation necessary. Important people see this and understand instantly. You aren't reactive. You aren't performative. You operate from internal clarity, not external approval. This shift also signals confidence and competence. People respect certainty. They notice when someone moves decisively, with minimal noise, and allows the results to define the narrative. There's a magnetic quality to that kind of self-direction. It says you understand leverage, timing, and the consequences of action in a way that words alone can never convey. You also protect your energy by doing this. Explaining every choice is exhausting, and it dilutes focus. You save your attention for action and strategy rather than persuasion. That efficiency creates results faster than those around you expect, and that's where real influence comes from. When people realize that the outcomes are undeniable and they can't rewrite or dispute them. Perhaps most importantly, this behavior signals sovereignty. You're not beholden to perception. You're not negotiating legitimacy. You have internal authority, and that kind of power is rare. By letting outcomes define your narrative, you create a reputation that is earned, not given. Important people notice because it's unusual. Most people chatter, justify, and rationalize endlessly. You don't. You act, you achieve, and your silence around the why makes your results heavier, sharper, and impossible to ignore. That is influence at its most refined, and it leaves a lasting impression that no explanation ever could. Number 8, you refuse to turn suffering into an identity. After something dreadful, most people make their suffering the centerpiece of who they are. They wear it like a badge, repeat it like a mantra, and let it define every decision and interaction. You didn't. You went through pain, but you refused to let it become your identity. You didn't use it to justify yourself, gain sympathy, or build a persona. You processed it, learned from it, and left it behind as a tool, not a label. That's what separates you from the crowd. Refusing to build an identity around suffering is quietly revolutionary. It shows a level of self-mastery most people never achieve. Pain becomes information, not a lifestyle. Every setback, betrayal, or failure is digested and translated into wisdom, timing, and judgment. People who watch you notice that you've internalized lessons without being consumed by them. You don't carry scars to signal endurance. You carry skill, strategy, and quiet authority. Important people are drawn to this because it's rare. They've seen those who anchor themselves in victimhood, who wear their past pain like armor, and they know it limits potential. Suffering as identity is performative, it's reactive. You didn't perform, you evolved. That shift makes your presence heavier, more commanding, and undeniably credible. By not turning suffering into identity, you also control narrative and perception. You decide what defines you, not your hardships. People who attempt to manipulate or undermine you quickly realize there's nothing to exploit. Your past is private, processed, and functional. It informs your choices, but does not govern them. This approach also creates freedom. You're not bound by expectation, pity, or nostalgia. You can move through challenges without the weight of a scripted identity. You operate from capability, not concession. That's why people notice you in a way that goes beyond admiration. It's respect, recognition, and subtle awe all at once. You survived, you learned, and you became stronger. Not by wearing your suffering, but by transcending it. And that kind of mastery is impossible to ignore. Number 9, you didn't seek revenge, you outpaced relevance. After something dreadful, most people instinctively reach for revenge. It's a natural impulse. Anger wants a target, pain wants acknowledgement, and ego wants justice. You didn't fall into that trap. You didn't waste energy on retaliation, and that's what makes your rise so striking. Instead of responding to the past, you outpaced it. You moved forward so efficiently, so deliberately, that the people who expected you to stumble or dwell behind you barely recognize where you are now. Outpacing relevance is subtle but deadly. It doesn't announce itself with noise or spectacle. It doesn't demand attention. Instead, It forces observers to recalibrate. The people who thought they understood your trajectory suddenly realized they were measuring the wrong pace. While they were fixated on the past or consumed with petty victories, you were building, evolving, and positioning yourself far beyond their reach. That creates an undeniable power, quiet, invisible, and devastating in its efficiency. Important people notice this instinctively. They've seen others squander talent on grudges or obsession over what could have been. They understand that true authority comes not from proving a point, but from being untouchable by it. You became untouchable not through strength alone, but through strategy, foresight, and timing. Every step you took was forward, calculated, and unassailable. That kind of mastery doesn't demand acknowledgement. It earns it silently. By choosing this path, you also liberated yourself from distraction. Revenge consumes energy, focus, and mental clarity. You chose to redirect all of that into growth, skill, and long-term advantage. That's why your results are heavier, sharper, and more impactful than anything reactive could produce. You didn't just recover, you rewrote the field entirely. There's a quiet, almost unsettling truth in this. While others are still entangled in the past, you are operating in the future. That difference between reaction and progression is exactly what grabs attention, commands respect, and leaves a lasting impression. You didn't compete on old terms. You created new ones. And that's how influence, power, and recognition are truly earned. Number 10, you became selective, not isolated. After something dreadful, most people either withdraw completely or overextend themselves trying to prove they're still relevant. You did something far more intelligent. You became selective. You didn't shut the world out. You simply chose where to invest your attention, time, and energy. Every interaction, every commitment, and every relationship had to earn a place in your orbit. That discernment is rare, and it speaks volumes to those who understand influence. Being selective isn't just about avoiding toxicity. It's about understanding leverage, who adds value, who drains energy, and who can help you operate at your best. You built invisible boundaries that keep you focused and efficient, and in doing so, you became unpredictable. People can't control your environment, influence your choices, or manipulate your attention because you've made it scarce and purposeful. That scarcity is magnetic. Important people notice it immediately because they understand its implications. Control your focus, and you control outcomes. This selectivity also communicates self-respect. You don't need to prove yourself to everyone, and you don't chase validation from those who offer little in return. You've learned that every person who enters your sphere must meet a standard, not just for utility, but for alignment with your trajectory. That's a kind of discipline most people misunderstand or overlook, yet it signals maturity, authority, and foresight. Another layer of this is subtle influence. By being selective, you shape perceptions without effort. People notice when access is limited, when attention is earned, and when presence is calculated. That quiet calibration makes your moves weightier and your presence more commanding. You're no longer just part of the crowd. You define your space, and that makes people respect it. You haven't isolated yourself from the world. You've engineered your environment. That distinction is crucial. Isolation is fear. Selectivity is strategy. By choosing carefully who and what deserves your energy, you operate on another level entirely. And those who understand the stakes, who observe your trajectory, recognize it immediately. They see someone deliberate, sovereign, and impossible to manipulate, a person whose presence carries impact without needing to shout for attention. Number 11, you stopped reacting to disrespect and started designing consequences. Most people react to disrespect instinctively. A slight, A snide remark or a misstep triggers an immediate response: anger, confrontation, or defensiveness. That's human, but it's also predictable and weak. You didn't follow that pattern. You observed, processed, and then shifted the game entirely. You stopped reacting and started designing consequences. Instead of letting emotion dictate action, you let strategy lead. That difference is seismic, and it's exactly what makes important people take notice. Designing consequences is about control. It's about making sure that every action, yours or theirs, has a measurable impact. You understood that disrespect doesn't need a reaction, it needs alignment. You don't negotiate respect with words. You enforce it through results, boundaries, and actions that speak louder than any argument ever could. That shift is subtle, but its weight is undeniable. People begin to notice patterns. Crossing you doesn't yield drama, it yields repercussions, carefully measured and unavoidable. This approach also demonstrates power without performance. You don't announce consequences. You don't post warnings. You simply act in a way that shapes outcomes, and by doing so, you signal authority far more effectively than any confrontation ever could. People who thought they could provoke you suddenly realize they can't. That quiet certainty, that mastery over cause and effect, is what separates someone respected from someone feared. Important people recognize this instinctively. They've seen how emotion clouds judgment, how reactive behavior erodes influence, and how unchecked disrespect can spiral into chaos. When they observe someone who neutralizes disrespect, not with noise but with strategy, they understand immediately. This is someone who cannot be manipulated, underestimated, or rushed. You've turned potential chaos into leverage. You've replaced reaction with design. That's not just growth, it's authority. And once people notice that you operate on consequence rather than impulse, they recalibrate their perception. You've become a presence that commands respect effortlessly, simply by choosing when, how, and to what extent the world touches you. That kind of control is rare, magnetic, and unforgettable. Number 12. You no longer rush success, which tells them you understand timing. After something dreadful, most people feel the urge to prove themselves quickly. They rush, overcommit, and act out of desperation to show they're still capable. You didn't. You slowed down, not because you were afraid or hesitant, but because you understood something few ever grasp. Timing is the invisible engine behind every meaningful outcome. You don't chase milestones. You align with the moment when impact meets opportunity. That awareness alone sets you apart. The people watching you notice this immediately. They've seen impatience disguise itself as ambition, and they've watched people stumble because they confused movement for progress. You operate differently. You don't let urgency compromise judgment. You wait, observe, and act when conditions maximize your advantage. That doesn't make you passive. It makes you untouchable. You've learned that real power isn't loud, it's deliberate. Rushing success often signals insecurity. Slow, measured progress signals mastery. It tells people that you've internalized your capabilities and that you don't need external validation to fuel your drive. Every step you take is intentional, every decision weighed against long-term consequences. By choosing when to act instead of reacting to pressure, you show control over circumstances that most people let control them. This approach also amplifies results. Hasty action produces temporary wins, but timing produces momentum that compounds, influence that lasts, and outcomes that are undeniable. Important people recognize the difference instinctively. They respect those who understand that patience is a form of strategy and that waiting is not weakness. It's calculation. Your approach communicates quiet confidence. You don't need to announce every plan or milestone because the right timing ensures that your results make their own statement. That makes your presence heavier, your trajectory clearer, and your achievements impossible to dispute. They see someone who isn't frantic or reactive, someone who moves with precision and foresight. And that realization, watching someone succeed not through speed but through perfect timing, creates a lasting impression that goes far beyond admiration. It's respect, recalibration, and quiet awe rolled into one. Number 13. You didn't become inspiring, you became undeniable. Most people think success after adversity is about inspiration. They craft a story meant to motivate, to elicit sympathy, or to make others feel hope. You didn't do that. You didn't seek applause or approval. You didn't package your growth as a lesson for anyone else. You became undeniable. Your presence, your choices, and your results speak in a language no one can ignore, and that is far more powerful than fleeting inspiration. Being undeniable isn't about charisma or theatrics. It's about consistency, competence, and unshakable focus. Every decision you make, every action you take, aligns with an internal logic that doesn't need validation. People notice when someone operates at that level because it defies expectation. They can't reduce you to a story or an example. They can only recognize the reality of your presence and the weight of your outcomes. That's influence without explanation. Important people recognize this immediately. They've seen those who try to inspire, who lean on emotion to carry them, and they know how fleeting it is. Inspiration fades. Charisma without structure is temporary. But being undeniable leaves evidence in the world that cannot be erased. Your achievements, your control, and the way you move through challenges create authority that's impossible to dispute. That's what commands attention, even when you speak softly or act quietly. You became someone who doesn't need to teach lessons to be respected. You don't need to highlight your struggles or victories. They are clear without commentary, embedded in your presence and your trajectory. That subtle, unspoken power is more impressive than any motivational speech because it carries permanence. There's a tension in being undeniable that draws people in. They want to measure it, understand it, even challenge it, but they can't. You've moved beyond being relatable or inspirational. You exist on a plane where results, control, and strategy define you. That's why very important people notice you. They aren't impressed by your story. They're aware of your reality. And reality, when fully mastered, leaves no room for doubt, debate, or dismissal. You are simply undeniable. Number 14. You emerged without needing witnesses, and that's what sealed it. Most people believe validation is part of triumph. They want recognition, applause, or at least someone to witness their rise. You didn't follow that path. You didn't rebuild under an audience, and you didn't announce every small victory. You emerged quietly, deliberately, and fully formed. That absence of spectacle is what makes your success so striking. It forces others to confront it on its own terms, not through commentary or hype. Emerging without witnesses is a different kind of power. It shows mastery over yourself before you ever have to prove anything to the world. While others chase attention, you refined skill, judgment, and discipline in private. Every decision, every step, every lesson was internalized, tested, and reinforced long before anyone could observe it. That kind of preparation creates outcomes that are airtight. By the time people notice, it's undeniable, not because you demanded recognition, but because your results leave no other option. Important people are drawn to this because they instinctively recognize authenticity and independence. They understand the difference between performative success and real influence. They've seen countless people seek applause while crumbling under pressure. Your quiet emergence signals a level of resilience, discipline, and self-reliance that's rare. You didn't need validation to define your progress. You defined it yourself, and the world only caught up afterward. This approach also communicates restraint and foresight. By not requiring witnesses, you remove variables that could distract, misinterpret, or dilute your trajectory. You operate on your own timeline, your own terms, and your own standards. That control is magnetic to those who understand stakes, strategy, and power dynamics. What seals the impression is subtle but profound. People don't just see your achievements, they sense the absence of need. You didn't survive for approval. You didn't rebuild for recognition. You emerged fully, independently, and without fanfare. That quiet sovereignty is what leaves very important people not just impressed, but aware that they are witnessing someone rare, someone who succeeds on their own terms and whose presence commands respect simply because it exists. The journey you've just explored isn't about luck, timing, or fleeting charisma. It's about transformation that runs deeper than anyone can immediately see. It's about taking something dreadful, something designed to break you, and turning it into an invisible engine of growth, strategy, and undeniable presence. You didn't just survive. You refined, disciplined, and elevated yourself in ways that command quiet respect. You metabolized pain, mastered timing, cultivated control, and emerged fully formed without needing anyone's validation. Every move, every choice, every outcome tells a story of someone who operates on their own terms, whose growth is measured not by applause, but by results, and whose presence leaves a lasting impression on those who truly understand influence and power. This is the kind of evolution that separates the ordinary from the remarkable, the performative from the authentic, and the visible from the undeniable. It's a blueprint, not just for surviving hardship, but for using it as fuel to become someone others quietly but powerfully notice. And the truth is, people who recognize this aren't just impressed by what you did, they're compelled by what you've become. If this resonated with you, and you want more insights that cut deeper than surface-level advice, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Like this video, if it gave you a new perspective, comment below with your thoughts or breakthroughs, and share it with someone who needs to see what true resilience and mastery look like. The journey doesn't end here. This is just the beginning of understanding how to rise, thrive, and become absolutely undeniable. Stay blessed always and Happy New Year.